Why is there a fighter jet tracking my plane? Samuel Reid's weathered hands gripped the controls of his old crop duster as the sleek silhouette of an F-16 appeared in his rearview mirror. Just yesterday, he had made a split-second decision to help a woman stranded in the worst storm to hit Oakridge County in decades. What had he gotten himself into, and why was the military now on his tail? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other on Whispering Pines. Farm! Samuel rose before dawn, the habit of 35 years of farming etched into his body clock. At 62, his once dark hair had faded to salt and pepper, and deep creases lined his sun-weathered face, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. He moved with the deliberate efficiency of a man who knew the value of every minute of daylight. After a simple breakfast of eggs and toast, he headed out to his pride and joy, a restored 1975 air tractor AT-301 crop duster. The plane was painted a vibrant red with gold trim, standing out against the patchwork of green and gold fields that stretched across his 200 acres. Samuel had nicknamed her Ruby, and he treated the aircraft with more care than most. People showed their luxury cars. "Looking good today, old girl," he murmured, running his hand along Ruby's fuselage. The metal was cool under his palm, still holding the chill of the night. Samuel had rebuilt the plane almost from scratch after buying it from a retiring farmer in Nebraska 10 years ago. It had become more than just a tool for his business. It was freedom, a way to rise above the endless tasks and worries of farm life. His farm manager, Eddie Thompson, approached with a clipboard in hand. Eddie had worked for Samuel for almost 15 years, a young man who had started as a seasonal worker and now practically ran the day-to-day operations. "Weather report just came in, boss," Eddie said, handing over the clipboard. "Storm front moving in faster than they predicted. Might want to get your spraying done earlier." Samuel studied the radar map. The scattered storm cells were indeed moving rapidly toward Oakridge County, their angry red and yellow colors a stark warning. "Thanks. I'll head out now and spray the north quadrant. Should be able to finish before the worst hits." "Want me to gas up the trucker's backup, in case?" "You can't fly back?" Samuel shook his head. "I've flown in worse. Besides, Ruby and I know these skies better than any weatherman." He tapped the side of his nose with a wink. "We can smell a storm coming." Eddie shrugged, used to his boss's confidence when it came to flying. "Your call. I'll make sure everything's secured here before it hits." Samuel performed his pre-flight checks with methodical precision, checking fuel levels, inspecting the spray equipment, testing the controls. Every movement was practiced, automatic after thousands of similar mornings. The familiar routine calmed him, centered him. Up in the air there was just him, Ruby, and the sky. No complications, no surprises. If only he had known how wrong that thought would prove to be. By 7:30 a.m., Samuel was airborne, the powerful engine rumbling beneath him as he guided Ruby over the northern fields. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the landscape, highlighting the contours of the land he knew as intimately as the lines on his own palm. Below him, rows of young corn stretched in perfect parallels, the plants glistening with morning dew. He adjusted his altitude, dropping lower to begin spraying the organic pesticide mixture. As Ruby's shadow skimmed across the crops, Samuel felt the familiar sense of satisfaction that came with a job well done. He had transitioned to organic farming methods 5 years ago, a move that had raised eyebrows among the older farmers in the county, but had ultimately proven profitable as demand for organic produce grew. As he completed his first pass, Samuel glanced westward. Dark clouds had begun to build on the horizon, their tops billowing upward like smoke from a massive fire. The storm was moving faster than he'd anticipated. He estimated he had about an hour, maybe less, before it hit with full force. "Let's make this quick, Ruby," he muttered, banking the plane for another pass. For the next 40 minutes, Samuel worked efficiently, covering as much ground as possible. The wind began to pick up, creating turbulence that bounced the small plane around more than he liked. The first raindrops hit his windshield just as he finished the final row. Perfect timing. Samuel turned Ruby toward home, but as he gained altitude, he noticed something unusual on County Road 27, which cut through the eastern edge of his property. A car, a small blue sedan, was pulled over at an awkward angle, half on the shoulder and half in a shallow ditch. Even from his altitude, Samuel could see a figure standing beside it, waving frantically. His first instinct was to radio Eddie to send help, but as Samuel circled lower, he saw the desperation in the woman's gestures. The sky behind her had turned an ominous greenish-black, and the wind was now strong enough that tree branches were whipping back and forth. This wasn't just a storm, it was shaping up to be a potential tornado situation. Samuel made a quick assessment. County Road 27 was rarely traveled, especially during bad weather. If he called for help, it might be an hour or more before anyone reached her. By then, she'd be in serious danger from the approaching storm. "Damn it," Samuel muttered, scanning the area for a place to land. There was a fallow field about a quarter-mile from the stranded car. Not ideal for landing, but Ruby could handle rough terrain if needed. Making his decision, Samuel circled back and lined up for the approach. He reduced speed, extended the flaps, and focused intently on his touchdown point. The first drops of rain were becoming a steady patter, and the crosswinds made controlling the plane increasingly difficult. Ruby's wheels touched down with a hard bounce, then another, before settling onto the uneven ground. Samuel cut the engine and quickly secured the aircraft, grabbing his emergency rain gear from behind the seat. As he jumped down from the cockpit, the wind nearly knocked him sideways. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees in the last hour, and the air felt charged with electricity. Samuel jogged toward the road, the tall grass whipping against his legs. By the time he reached the stranded car, he was already soaked through despite his rain gear. The woman was still standing beside the vehicle, clutching a thin jacket around herself as protection from the elements. As Samuel approached, he could see she was younger than he'd expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair plastered too. Her face from the rain. Her clothes looked expensive but impractical for the weather, a light blazer, tailored pants, and what had probably been nice leather shoes now covered in mud. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Need some help? Samuel called over the rising wind. The woman turned, startled by his voice. For a moment she looked almost afraid, her eyes widening as she took in his sudden appearance. Then relief washed over her face. "Thank God," she shouted back. "My car just died, and there's no cell service out here. I've been trying to flag someone down for almost an hour." Samuel glanced at her car. The front end was dipped slightly into the shallow ditch, but it didn't look seriously damaged. "What happened?" "I'm not sure. The engine just cut out, and when I tried to pull over, I slid into the ditch. I don't know anything about cars." She pushed her wet hair from her face. "I'm Vanessa, by the way." "Samuel Reid," he replied, extending his hand. "This is my land you're stranded on." She shook his hand briefly. "How did you find me?" "I haven't seen another car pass by since I broke down." Samuel gestured toward the sky. "I was flying overhead, saw you waving." Vanessa looked confused for a moment, then her eyes widened in understanding. "You were in that small plane, and you landed just to help me?" Samuel shrugged, embarrassed by her surprise. "Couldn't just leave you out here with this storm coming. Speaking of which, we need to get moving. This weather's turning nasty fast." As if to emphasize his point, a crack of thunder boomed overhead, followed by a sudden intensification of the rain. Vanessa flinched at the sound. "My farm's about 3 miles from here," Samuel said. "We can take shelter there until the storm passes, then figure out what to do about your car." Vanessa hesitated, glancing back at her vehicle. "My luggage. We can grab whatever you need. The rest should be safe enough." She nodded and quickly retrieved a sleek laptop bag and a small overnight case from the trunk. Samuel noted that she kept the laptop bag especially close, clutching it against her chest as they headed toward his plane. As they reached Ruby, Vanessa stopped short. "We're flying in this weather?" Samuel smiled reassuringly. "Just a quick hop to my farm. I've flown through worse, and it'll be safer than trying to walk 3 miles in this." He didn't mention that walking wasn't really an option with the way the storm was intensifying. Vanessa looked skeptically at the crop duster, then at the churning sky, before nodding reluctantly. "I guess I don't have much choice." Samuel helped her climb into the passenger seat, a retrofit he'd added for the occasional times he took Eddie up with him, and showed her how to secure the harness. He noticed her hands were shaking slightly, though whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. Once they were both strapped in, Samuel fired up Ruby's engine. The familiar roar seemed to startle Vanessa, who gripped the edges of her seat tightly. As they taxied across the uneven field, the crop duster bounced and jostled them roughly. "Sorry about the rough ride," Samuel called over the engine noise. "It'll smooth out once we're airborne." Vanessa nodded, her face pale but determined. As they picked up speed for takeoff, Samuel could feel her tension beside him. The moment the wheels left the ground, she gasped audibly, her knuckles white. On the seat edge, the crop duster climbed steadily, pushing through the increasingly turbulent air. Wind gusts buffeted them from all sides, making the small aircraft shudder and jump. Samuel kept his hands steady on the controls, his face a mask of concentration. This would be a challenging flight, even for his experience level. They broke through the lower cloud layer into momentary rainfall-free air, giving them glimpses of the landscape below. Samuel banked gently to the northwest, heading toward the cluster of buildings that made up Whispering Pines Farm. The main house, a 2-story farmhouse that had stood for over a century, was visible in the distance, along with the large red barn and equipment sheds. "That's your farm?" Vanessa asked, her voice tight but controlled. Samuel nodded. "Been in my family for 4 generations. My grandfather built that airstrip we're heading for." As they descended toward the private landing strip, the turbulence increased again. Rain lashed against the windshield, reducing visibility. Samuel flew mostly by instinct now, knowing every approach angle and landmark by heart. Ruby touched down with a harder bump than usual, but she rolled safely to a stop near the small hangar. "We made it," Samuel said with a reassuring smile. Cutting the engine. Vanessa released her death grip on the seat, flexing her fingers. "That was intense." "Sorry about that. Mother Nature doesn't always cooperate." Samuel reached behind his seat and pulled out a spare rain jacket. Here, put this on. We've got to make a run for the house." They dashed from the plane to the farmhouse, rain driving against them like needles. By the time they reached the covered porch, they were both soaked despite the rain gear. Samuel pushed open the heavy wooden door, ushering Vanessa into the warm interior. The farmhouse was rustic but comfortable, with wide plank wooden floors and a stone fireplace dominating the living room. The decor was simple and practical: worn leather furniture, handmade quilts, and family photos lining the walls. The smell of cinnamon and apples lingered in the air. "Margaret!" Samuel called out, helping Vanessa remove her sodden jacket. "We've got company!" A woman in her late 50s appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and smile lines crinkled around her eyes. She looked surprised, but quickly composed herself. "Well, hello there," she said, extending a hand to Vanessa. "I'm Margaret Thompson, the housekeeper, and occasional cook, gardener, and whatever else needs doing around here." "Vanessa," the younger woman replied, shaking Margaret's hand briefly. "I'm sorry to intrude. My car broke down, and Mr. Reid was kind enough to help." Margaret raised an eyebrow at Samuel. "You flew in this weather to rescue a stranded motorist. Your good deeds will be the death of you one day, Samuel Reid." Despite her words, her tone was warm with obvious affection. Samuel shrugged. "Couldn't leave her out there with that storm rolling in. Speaking of which, has Eddie secured everything? In the East Fields?" "He's out there now with the boys," Margaret replied. "Said he'd be back before the worst hits." She turned to Vanessa. "You're soaked through, dear. Let me find you some dry clothes while Samuel gets a fire going." Vanessa clutched her laptop bag tighter. "I have a change of clothes in my overnight bag. If you could just show me where I can change." Margaret nodded. "Of course. Bathroom's upstairs. First door on the right. Towels are in the cabinet." As Vanessa headed upstairs, Samuel moved to the fireplace and began arranging kindling and logs. Margaret watched him with a knowing look. "Pretty girl," she remarked casually. "Not exactly dressed for country driving, is she?" Samuel glanced up from his task. "Noticed that too, did you?" "Hard not to. Those are designer clothes, and that's a mighty expensive laptop bag she's guarding like it contains state secrets." Margaret crossed her arms. "What's her story?" "Don't know yet," Samuel admitted, striking a match to light the kindling. "Car trouble is real enough, though. Saw it myself. We can call Pete's garage once the storm passes." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Well, we've weathered stranger situations. I'll put some coffee on and heat up that beef stew from yesterday." By the time Vanessa returned downstairs, the fire was crackling cheerfully, and the aroma of rich beef stew filled the air. She had changed into simple jeans and a sweater, her wet hair combed back from her face. She still carried the laptop bag, setting it carefully beside her as she took a seat at the kitchen table. "Feel better?" Samuel asked, placing mugs of steaming coffee before her. "Much, thank you." Vanessa wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "I can't thank you enough for helping me. Most people wouldn't have gone to such lengths." Samuel waved away her thanks. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Vanessa said with surprising firmness. "They wouldn't have." Something in her tone suggested she had experience with being left stranded in more ways than one. As Margaret served the stew, Samuel tried to make conversation. "So what brings you to Oakridge County? Not exactly on the tourist map?" Vanessa took a careful sip of her coffee before answering. "Work. I'm a consultant, agricultural efficiency." "Really?" Samuel's interest was piqued. For one of the big corporate farms? A slight hesitation. Something like that. You picked quite a day for it, Margaret commented, joining them at the table. This storm's been on the forecast for days. It moved up faster than expected, Vanessa replied smoothly. Much like my schedule. Samuel noticed she was good at answering questions without actually providing information. Years of negotiating with bank managers and agricultural corporations had taught him to recognize the technique. The conversation drifted to safer topics, the unusual weather patterns this year, the challenges of organic farming, Margaret's prize-winning apple pies. Vanessa was polite but reserved, offering little about herself despite Samuel and Margaret's gentle probing. As they finished their meal, the storm outside intensified. Rain pounded against the windows and wind howled around the corners of the old farmhouse. Occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the darkened landscape, followed by booming thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations. Power might go out, Samuel remarked, glancing at the flickering lights. Generator should kick in if it does. Vanessa's eyes darted to her laptop bag. Is your internet connection stable here? When the power's on, Samuel replied, but the storm might knock it out too. A look of concern crossed Vanessa's face before she quickly masked it. Of course. That makes sense. The front door burst open then, bringing a gust of wind and rain along with Eddie. The farm manager was drenched, his weathered face serious as he removed his dripping rain gear. Everything secured? Samuel asked, rising to help him. Eddie nodded. Just about. Had to move the new tractor to higher ground, creeks rising fast. He noticed Vanessa and paused. Sorry, didn't realize we had company. Samuel made quick introductions. Eddie gave Vanessa a curious once-over, but merely nodded politely before turning back to Samuel. There's something else, he said in a lower voice. Hayes from the North Property called. Said he saw some unusual activity near the old fire road, vehicles that didn't look local. Samuel frowned. What kind of vehicles? Black SUVs, government plates. Hayes thought they might be FEMA, checking flood risks with the storm, but they didn't stop when he waved them down. Samuel stroked his chin thoughtfully. Odd timing. Keep an eye out if you head back that way. Eddie nodded and headed upstairs to change, while Samuel returned to the table. He noticed Vanessa had gone very still, her spoon suspended halfway to her mouth. Everything okay? He asked. She set the spoon down carefully. Fine. Just tired, I think. It's been a stressful day. Margaret can make up the guest room for you, Samuel offered. Storm's not letting up any time soon, and the roads will be a mess even after it passes. I couldn't impose, Vanessa began. Nonsense, Margaret interjected. That little blue car of yours isn't going anywhere tonight, and neither should you. After a moment's hesitation, Vanessa nodded. Thank you. That's very kind. As Margaret led Vanessa upstairs to the guest room, Samuel remained at the table, turning over Eddie's information in his mind. Government vehicles weren't unusual during natural disasters, but something about the timing nagged at him. He dismissed the thought. Probably nothing to do with their unexpected guest. Later that evening, as the storm continued its assault on Whispering Pines Farm, Samuel sat in his study, reviewing quarterly projections. The power had flickered several times, but held steady. Eddie had gone to bed early, exhausted from securing the farm against the storm. Margaret had retired to her cottage on the property after ensuring everyone had what they needed for the night. Around midnight, Samuel decided to call it a day. As he walked through the darkened hallway toward his bedroom, he paused. A faint voice was coming from the guest room, Vanessa's voice, urgent and low. Samuel wasn't in the habit of eavesdropping, but something in her tone made him hesitate. He couldn't make out the words clearly, just fragments. Confirmed location. Data secure, Udgrim. Need more time. Then more distinctly, if they've tracked me here, the farmer could be in danger too. Samuel's blood ran cold. What had he brought into his home? He moved silently away from the door and back to his study, mind racing. Whatever Vanessa was involved in, it was clearly more complicated than agricultural consulting. And now it potentially threatened his farm, his home. Samuel considered his options. He could confront her directly, but if she was dangerous, that might escalate the situation. He could call the sheriff, but what would he say? That he'd overheard a cryptic phone conversation? That didn't give the authorities much to go on. In the end, Samuel decided to wait and watch. Morning would bring clearer skies and hopefully clearer answers. He would keep his suspicions to himself for now, but he'd make sure Eddie was alert to any unusual activity around the farm. With that decision made, Samuel returned to his bedroom, though sleep came fitfully. Outside, the storm gradually began to subside, the wind dying down to occasional gusts as the worst of the system moved eastward. By dawn, only a steady drizzle remained. Samuel rose early, as was his habit. The farm would need checking after such a significant storm. Fences repaired, drainage ditches cleared, livestock accounted for. As he passed the guest room, he noted the door was still closed. Vanessa was either still sleeping or choosing to remain in her room. In the kitchen, he found Eddie already at the table, nursing a cup of coffee and studying radar images on his tablet. Storms moved on, Eddie reported. Creeks high but holding. No major damage that I can see from the house. Samuel nodded, pouring himself coffee. I'll take Ruby up once it clears a bit more. Get an aerial view. About your guest, Eddie said, lowering his voice. I ran the plates on her car last night. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Eddie had connections in the sheriff's department. His brother-in-law was a deputy. Rental car, Eddie continued. Picked up at Westfield Regional Airport 2 days ago. Not unusual for a business traveler, Samuel pointed out. No, Eddie agreed, but the rental was paid for with a government credit card. Department of Energy. Samuel frowned. She said she was an agricultural consultant. Maybe she is, Eddie shrugged. DOE does have agricultural programs, alternative fuels, that sort of thing. But still seems odd she wouldn't just say that. And before Samuel could respond, they heard footsteps on the stairs. Vanessa appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed in the same clothes as yesterday, but looking remarkably put together. Her laptop bag was, as always, at her side. Good morning, she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. The storm seems to have passed. Samuel nodded, studying her with new awareness. Should clear up enough soon for me to fly you into town. I called Pete's garage about your car. They'll send someone out to take a look once the roads are passable. That's very kind, Vanessa replied, but I've already called a colleague who's in the area. They should be able to pick me up within the hour. Samuel and Eddie exchanged glances. Cell service was often spotty after storms, and the farm's landline hadn't rung. Must have used my satellite phone, Vanessa added, noting their confusion. I keep it for emergencies. Battery was low yesterday, or I would have used it then. Another convenient explanation, Samuel thought. Well, if your ride falls through, my offer stands. Vanessa nodded gratefully, accepting the coffee Margaret had prepared before heading out to check her garden. For the next half hour, conversation remained polite but superficial. Vanessa volunteered nothing more about herself or her work, and Samuel didn't press. He was too busy trying to piece together what little he knew about her. When the sound of vehicles approaching reached them, Samuel wasn't entirely surprised. What did surprise him was the number, at least 3 by the sound of the engines, and their speed. Eddie moved to the window. "Black SUVs," he reported tensely. "Same ones from yesterday, I'd bet." Vanessa had gone very still. "I need to leave," she said quietly, gathering her laptop bag. "Now." "Those your colleagues?" Samuel asked, his tone making it clear he doubted it. Instead of answering, Vanessa looked directly at him for the first time since she'd arrived. "Mr. Reid, you've been incredibly kind, and I regret bringing this to your doorstep, but I need to ask one more favor. Did you say you were planning to take your plane up this morning?" Samuel's suspicions crystallized in that moment. Whatever Vanessa was running from, it had found her, and by extension him. "What exactly have you brought to my farm, Vanessa, if that's even your real name?" Her expression hardened slightly. "I don't have time to explain everything, but I promise you I'm not the threat here. Those people outside, they are." The vehicles had stopped. Car doors slammed in quick succession. "Samuel!" Eddie warned from the window. "They're armed." Samuel's mind raced. Armed men were approaching his farmhouse, and somehow this woman, whoever she really was, stood at the center of it all. He had seconds to make a decision that could change everything. "Eddie, get Margaret and head to the storm cellar," Samuel ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Take the back way through the kitchen." Eddie hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." When Eddie still didn't move, Samuel clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Go, now!" As Eddie disappeared through the kitchen, Samuel turned to Vanessa. Last chance for the truth. Vanessa clutched her laptop bag tighter, her knuckles white. "My name is Dr. Vanessa Mitchell. I'm a research scientist with the Department of Energy's Advanced Research Division. What's in this bag could revolutionize sustainable agriculture or be weaponized by the wrong people." The front door rattled with a sharp knock. "Federal agents, open up!" Samuel processed this information in an instant. "The old cellar tunnel comes out near the hangar. If we're going to go, it has to be now." Vanessa nodded, relief flashing across her face. Together, they moved swiftly through the kitchen and down the narrow stairs to the root cellar, a relic from the farm's early days, when tornadoes were frequent and refrigeration non-existent. Eddie and Margaret were already there, faces tense, with confusion and fear. "What's happening, Samuel?" Margaret demanded. "No time," Samuel replied, moving to the far wall where a heavy metal shelf stood. "Help me with this." Together, he and Eddie slid the shelf aside, revealing a low, narrow tunnel, part of an underground railroad route that had once helped escaped slaves find freedom. The irony wasn't lost on Samuel as he ushered Vanessa toward it. "This comes out about 50 yards from the hangar," he explained quickly. "Stay low and move fast." Behind them, they heard the crash of the front door being forced open, followed by heavy footsteps and shouted commands. Samuel turned to Eddie and Margaret. "I need you two to stall them. Say I took Vanessa to town to check on her car." Margaret's eyes sharpened with understanding. "And where will you really be?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "Better you don't know. Just get to the storm shelter if things get dicey." Eddie gripped Samuel's arm. "Be careful, boss." Samuel nodded, then followed Vanessa into the tunnel, pulling the shelf back in place behind them. The passageway was damp and cramped, forcing them to move in a hunched position. Decades of farm sediment had accumulated on the dirt floor, and cobwebs clung to their hair and clothes as they progressed. "You said this leads to your hangar?" Vanessa whispered, her breath visible in the cool underground air. "Close enough," Samuel replied. "We'll still have to cross about 30 yards of open ground. Let's hope your friends are focused on the house." "They're not my friends," Vanessa said sharply. "Those men work for Private Core Industries, a private military contractor that's been infiltrating government research programs for years." Samuel processed this as they continued through the darkness. "And what exactly is in that bag they want so badly?" Vanessa hesitated before answering. "Proprietary nanotechnology that can enhance crop yield by 300% while reducing water usage. By half, it could end food insecurity globally. And as a weapon, the same tech could destroy agricultural systems just as easily. Imagine every crop field in America failing simultaneously. The implications hit Samuel like a physical blow. No wonder armed men were storming his farmhouse. Whatever side was right in this conflict, the stakes were clearly enormous. They reached the end of the tunnel where a rusty ladder led up to a metal hatch. Samuel climbed first, pushing against the heavy cover. It resisted years of disuse, having partially sealed it shut. With a grunt of effort, he forced it open and pulled himself up into the grey morning light. They emerged behind an old storage, shed about 40 yards from the hangar where Ruby waited. Samuel quickly surveyed their surroundings. 2 black SUVs were parked in front of his farmhouse, but a third had been positioned near the hangar. Someone had anticipated their escape. Rout. 2 men in tactical gear stood near the hangar entrance, weapons visible at their sides. "Damn it," Samuel muttered. "They've got Ruby covered." Vanessa tensed beside him. "What now?" Samuel considered their options. The main road was too exposed, and on foot they wouldn't get far before being caught. His gaze drifted to the equipment shed where his old farm truck was parked. "Change of plans," he said. "Follow me and stay low." They crept along the edge of the property, using outbuildings and equipment for cover. When they reached the equipment shed, Samuel led Vanessa inside and pointed to his 1986 Ford pickup. "Not as fast as Ruby, but they won't be expecting it," he explained, fishing the keys from their hiding place behind a service panel. The truck's engine coughed to life on the second try, the old diesel motor growling like a waking beast. Samuel saw the men by the hangar turn at the sound, raising their weapons. "Hold on," he warned, then floored the accelerator. The truck burst from the shed, tires spinning in the mud before finding traction. Samuel aimed not for the main drive, but for the eastern field access road, little more than 2 dirt tracks through newly planted corn. In his rearview mirror, he saw the men running toward their vehicle. "They're coming after us," Vanessa reported, twisting to look behind them. "Let them try," Samuel replied grimly. "I know these fields better than anyone." He navigated the truck through a series of turns that would be bewildering to anyone without intimate knowledge of Whispering Pines Farm, between equipment sheds, through a shallow creek crossing along the edge of the orchard. The SUV attempting to follow them soon bogged down in a particularly muddy section that Samuel had deliberately driven through, knowing exactly where the firm ground was beneath the surface muck. "That'll hold them for a while," Samuel said with grim satisfaction. "But they'll radio the others. We need to get off my property fast." The eastern boundary of his farm connected to a network of logging roads that wound through the hills beyond Oakridge County. If they could reach those, they might have a chance to disappear long enough to figure out their next move. As Samuel guided the truck onto a narrow forest track. Vanessa finally seemed to catch her breath. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You didn't have to help me." "Didn't have much choice once they started waving guns around my farm," Samuel replied, eyes fixed on the rough road ahead. "But I think it's time you tell me the full story. No more half-truths." Vanessa nodded, her fingers still wrapped protectively around her laptop bag. "I've been working on Project Verdant, a classified DOE initiative to develop nanotechnology for agricultural applications. 6 months ago, I discovered someone was copying my research data and sending it to Privacor, the military contractor," Samuel supplied. "Yes, they're owned by Maxwell Riker, a man with significant defense connections and questionable ethics. When I reported the security breach through proper channels, things got complicated." "How complicated?" "My lab assistant was found dead in her apartment 3 days later. Suicide, according to the official report." Vanessa's voice hardened. She'd been helping me track the data breach. Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "So you ran?" "Not immediately. I gathered evidence, copied my research data, and tried to reach my division director. But he was suddenly unavailable. That's when I knew how high this went." She took a deep breath. "I've spent the last week trying to reach Senator Eleanor Kingsley. She chairs the Oversight Committee for Energy Research and has a reputation for integrity." "And the storm stranded you before you could reach her," Samuel concluded. "Her family has a summer home about 30 miles from here. I was on my way there when my car trouble started." Vanessa glanced behind them nervously. "I suspect they were tracking me through my phone, which is why I claimed it was dead." The truck bounced over a particularly rough section of road, forcing Samuel to slow down. They were deep in the forest now, the muddy track barely visible among the underbrush. He checked his watch. 7:45 a.m. By now, the men would have questioned. Eddie and Margaret. When they realized they'd been deceived, their response would likely escalate. "These logging roads connect to Highway 16 eventually," Samuel said, "but we can't stay on them forever. They'll have called in reinforcements, maybe even helicopters." Vanessa nodded grimly. "If Riker is involved personally, he won't hesitate to use every resource. The technology I've developed is worth billions." Samuel considered their options as the truck wound its way through the dense forest. "There's an old hunting cabin about 10 miles from here. Friend of mine owns it, doesn't use it much except during deer season. We might be able to lay low there, figure out our next move." "Will your phone work out here?" Vanessa asked. "I could try to contact Senator Kingsley directly." Samuel shook his head. "Service is spotty at best, but there's a landline at the cabin. Old school, but it works." They drove in tense silence for the next half hour, the truck's tires occasionally slipping on the muddy ground. The morning's drizzle had stopped, but the previous night's downpour had left the forest floor saturated. Samuel kept one eye on the fuel gauge. The old Ford wasn't known for its efficiency, and they were burning through diesel quickly on the rough terrain. As they rounded a bend, Samuel suddenly hit the brakes. About 50 yards ahead, a large tree had fallen across the road, completely blocking their path. "That wasn't there 2 weeks ago," he muttered, scanning the surrounding forest suspiciously. Vanessa tensed. "You think they got ahead of us somehow?" "Maybe," Samuel admitted. "Or it could just be storm damage. Either way, we can't go forward." He shifted the truck into reverse. "We'll have to backtrack and take the North Fork." As he began to turn the vehicle around in the narrow space, the distinct sound of an approaching helicopter reached them, growing louder by the second. They've called in air support, Vanessa said, her voice tight with fear. Samuel accelerated back the way they had come, but the helicopter was moving faster than they could on the rough road. Within minutes, it appeared overhead, a sleek black aircraft with no identifying markings visible. No government or police insignia, Samuel noted grimly. Your corporate friends don't play by official rules, do they? Vanessa shook her head, ducking instinctively as the helicopter swooped lower. Privacor operates in the grey areas. That's what makes them so dangerous. The chopper passed overhead, then circled back, hovering above them. A mechanical voice boomed from a loudspeaker. Stop your vehicle immediately. This is your only warning. Samuel gripped the steering wheel tighter. If we stop now, what happens to you? Vanessa's face was grim. Best case scenario, I disappear into a private detention facility while they extract everything I know. Worst case, I have an accident like my assistant. That was all Samuel needed to hear. He pressed the accelerator to the floor, pushing the old truck as fast as it could. Safely go on the treacherous road. The helicopter stayed with them easily, descending lower until it was barely skimming the treetops. They're going to try to force us off the road, Samuel shouted over the roar of the rotors. As if confirming his words, the helicopter dropped, even lower, positioning itself directly in front of them. The wash from the rotors sent leaves and small branches flying into their windshield, reducing visibility to nearly zero. Samuel gritted his teeth and kept driving, relying on his knowledge of the road to guide them. The truck shuddered and bounced violently as they hit potholes and exposed roots. Suddenly the forest opened up into a small clearing, and Samuel saw their opportunity. An old fire road branched off to the right, barely visible among the underbrush, but still passable. Without hesitation, he wrenched the steering wheel, sending the truck lurching onto the narrow path just as the helicopter made another pass. The dense canopy above the fire road provided some cover, making it harder for the aircraft to track them. Samuel pressed their advantage, navigating the unfamiliar route with the skill of someone who had spent a lifetime traversing difficult terrain. I think we lost them, Vanessa said after several minutes, peering through the rear window. The sound of the helicopter had faded, but Samuel wasn't ready to celebrate yet. Temporarily, they'll figure out which way we went soon enough. He checked the truck's fuel gauge and frowned. They were running dangerously low, another consequence of their off-road evasive maneuvers. The fire road, according to his mental map of the area, should eventually connect to County Road 42, which would lead them back towards civilization. The question was whether they had enough fuel to reach it. As if reading his thoughts, Vanessa asked, "How much farther to this cabin you mentioned?" "At this rate, another hour at least," Samuel admitted, "and we might not have the fuel to make it." Vanessa fell silent, clearly calculating their dwindling options. Finally she spoke, again her voice resolute. "Mr. Reid, I want to thank you for everything you've done. But this isn't your fight. If we reach a main road, you could drop me off and return to your farm. Tell them I forced you to help me. They might believe it." Samuel shot her a skeptical look. "You think men who are willing to stage suicides and send armed teams after civilians are going to take my word for it? I helped you escape. In their eyes, that makes me an accomplice. But your farm, your life, might already be compromised," Samuel finished for her. "Eddie and Margaret are smart. Once they realized things were serious, they would have contacted Sheriff Landry. The local authorities should be involved by now." The unspoken question hung between them. Would local law enforcement be enough against a private military contractor with seemingly unlimited resources? The fire road began to widen slightly as they descended from the higher elevation. Signs of recent use appeared, tire tracks in the mud, cleared brush along the edges. Samuel slowed the truck, suddenly cautious. "Someone's been maintaining this road," he observed quietly. Vanessa straightened in her seat, alert to the new potential threat. "Logging company?" "Maybe," Samuel conceded, though something felt off. The maintenance seemed too precise, too deliberate for standard forestry work. They rounded a bend, and Samuel immediately hit the brakes. Ahead of them, the fire road intersected with a wider gravel path, and parked across that intersection was another black SUV. Two men in tactical gear stood beside it, weapons drawn and aimed directly at the truck. "Damn it," Samuel muttered, shifting into reverse. Before he could back away, the sound of an engine behind them confirmed his fears. They were boxed in. Another SUV had followed them down the fire road and now blocked their retreat. "They herded us," Vanessa realized, her voice hollow. "The fallen tree, the helicopter, it was all to drive us exactly where they wanted us." Samuel's mind raced through their options, each more desperate than the last. They could try to ram one of the vehicles, but the old farm truck was no match for the reinforced SUVs. They could attempt to flee on foot into the forest, but armed pursuers would catch them quickly in the open terrain. The men from both vehicles were advancing now, moving with the coordinated precision of military training. Samuel counted 6 of them total, all heavily armed and wearing body armor. "Dr. Mitchell," a voice called through a handheld bullhorn. "This pursuit ends now. Exit the vehicle with your hands visible and surrender the research data." Vanessa's fingers tightened around her laptop bag. "They'll kill us both once they have what they want," she whispered. Samuel believed her. Something in the cold efficiency of these men told him they weren't the type to leave witnesses. Yet their options had dwindled to nearly nothing. "When I count to 3, he said quietly, "open your door and run for the trees on your side. I'll create a distraction." "What? No!" 3. Samuel suddenly threw the truck into drive and floored the accelerator, aiming not for the SUVs, but for the narrow gap between one vehicle and the dense forest edge. The sudden movement caught their pursuers off guard, buying precious seconds. As the truck lurched forward, Vanessa flung her door open as instructed. Samuel caught a glimpse of her diving into the underbrush as he wrenched the steering wheel, skidding the truck sideways to provide her cover. Shouts erupted from the armed men, followed almost immediately by the crack of gunfire. Bullets pinged against the truck's metal body. The windshield shattered, sending glass shards flying through the cabin. Samuel felt a sharp sting as fragments cut his face and hands, but he kept his focus on creating as much chaos as possible. He slammed the truck into the side of one SUV, the impact jarring every bone in his body. The airbag deployed with explosive force, momentarily dazing him. Through the ringing in his ears, Samuel heard continued shouting and gunfire, but it seemed focused away from him. They were pursuing Vanessa into the woods. Fighting through the disorientation, Samuel forced his door open and tumbled out onto the muddy ground. His left arm throbbed with pain, possibly broken from the impact, but adrenaline pushed him forward. While the majority of the armed team had pursued Vanessa, 2 remained by the vehicles, one checking the disabled truck. Samuel kept low, using the damaged vehicles for cover as he moved toward the forest edge where Vanessa had disappeared. He had nearly reached the tree line when a shout behind him confirmed he'd been spotted. "Stop right there!" The command was punctuated by the ominous sound of a weapon being readied. Samuel froze, slowly raising his hands in surrender. He turned to find one of the tactical team members aiming directly at his chest, the man's expression cold and professional. "On your knees," the man ordered. Samuel complied, mind racing for any way out of this situation. The pain in his arm was intensifying as the initial shock wore off. "Where is Dr. Mitchell heading?" the man demanded. "I don't know," Samuel answered truthfully. "She just ran." The man spoke into his radio. "I've secured the driver. Continuing search for primary. A target." From deeper in the forest came the sound of shouting. They must have spotted Vanessa again. Samuel's captor turned slightly toward the noise, his attention divided for just a moment. It was the only opening Samuel would get. With a farmer's strength built over decades of physical labor, he lunged forward despite the pain, tackling the surprised guard. They crashed to the ground, struggling for control of the weapon. Samuel's injured arm screamed in protest, but desperation lent him strength. The guard was younger and professionally trained, but Samuel had the advantage of weight and the element of surprise. He managed to wrench the weapon away, then delivered a solid punch that left the man stunned. Samuel stumbled to his feet, now armed but still vastly outnumbered. The sounds from the forest had changed. A woman's cry of pain, followed by triumphant shouts. They had Vanessa. Without conscious thought, Samuel moved toward the sounds, weapon ready. He had never fired anything more powerful than a hunting rifle, but the fundamentals couldn't be that different. More importantly, he couldn't leave Vanessa in their hands, not after what she'd told him about her assistant's fate. He crept through the underbrush, following the voices until he spotted them, 3 men surrounding Vanessa, who was on her knees clutching her laptop bag. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, and her expression was a mixture of defiance and fear. "Final chance, Doctor," one of the men was saying. "Give us the drive voluntarily or we take it." "People know what you're doing," Vanessa responded, her voice steady despite her situation. "Senator Kingsley has been notified." The man laughed. "If that were true, you wouldn't have been running to her cabin, would you? No one knows, and no one will know." Samuel took aim at a tree several yards from the group and fired. The shot echoed through the forest, causing immediate confusion among Vanessa's captors as they swung their weapons toward the perceived threat. Samuel fired again, this time closer to them. In the chaos, Vanessa reacted with remarkable presence of mind. She lashed out at the nearest guard, knocking him off balance, then scrambled to her feet and ran, not away from the confrontation, but directly toward where Samuel was concealed. "Run!" Samuel shouted, emerging from his hiding place to cover her retreat. Together they fled deeper into the forest, pursuit close behind them. Samuel's knowledge of the terrain gave them a slight advantage, but it wouldn't last long against trained trackers. "We need to split up," Vanessa gasped as they paused behind a large fallen log. "You go north toward the main road. I'll head east." "So they can pick us off individually? Not a chance," Samuel countered. "Besides, I know where we are now. There's an old ranger station about a mile from here. Might have a radio we can use." Vanessa studied his face, clearly weighing their dwindling options. Finally, she nodded. "Lead the way." As they continued their desperate flight through the forest, Samuel couldn't help wondering how his simple decision to help a stranded motorist had cascaded into this life-or-death struggle. Yet even knowing the outcome, he realized he would make the same choice again. Some actions defined a person's character, and walking away from someone in need had never been in Samuel Reid's nature. The question now was whether his principles would get them both killed or somehow lead to their salvation. The old ranger station appeared through the trees like a mirage, a small wooden structure, weathered by years of exposure, but still standing defiantly against the elements. Samuel and Vanessa approached cautiously, alert for any sign their pursuers had anticipated this move. "Hasn't been used in years," Samuel whispered as they crouched behind a thicket of rhododendrons. "Budget cuts closed most of these remote stations." Vanessa nodded, her breathing still labored from their desperate flight through the forest. "How do you know about it?" "Used to fish these woods as a boy. Rangers would check our licenses, give us weather warnings." Samuel smiled, faintly at the memory. Different times. After confirming the area seemed clear, they made their way to the station's rear entrance. The door was secured with a padlock, but years of neglect had weakened the surrounding wood. Samuel delivered a powerful kick near the lock, and the jamb splintered, allowing them access. Inside, dust covered every surface, and the musty scent of abandonment hung in the air. Sunlight filtered through dirty windows, illuminating dancing particles of dust. The main room contained a desk, 2 chairs, and several filing cabinets. A small kitchenette occupied one corner, while a door presumably led to simple sleeping quarters. Samuel moved immediately to the communications equipment on the desk, an older radio setup that had once connected this remote outpost to forestry headquarters. "Will it work?" Vanessa asked, securing the broken door behind them as best she could. Samuel examined the equipment with a critical eye. "Power's been off for years, but these run on backup batteries too." He flipped several switches experimentally. Nothing happened. Dead. Vanessa's shoulders slumped, but only momentarily. With renewed determination, she began searching the small station. There must be something useful here: first aid supplies, maps, emergency equipment. Samuel nodded, impressed by her resilience. Despite everything she'd been through, the betrayal at her laboratory, the death of her assistant, and now a violent pursuit through the wilderness, she hadn't surrendered to despair. Instead, she continued to seek solutions, to adapt to their changing circumstances. Their search yielded modest results: a first aid kit with basic supplies, 2 emergency blankets, a small tool kit, and, most valuably, detailed topographical maps of the surrounding forest. They also discovered a hand-crank emergency radio, which Samuel immediately began to power up. "If we can reach the sheriff's department or forest service," Samuel began. The distant sound of helicopter rotors interrupted him. The mechanical thrum grew steadily louder. Their pursuers had regrouped and taken to the air again. "They're using infrared," Vanessa said grimly. "This building will stand out against the forest background." Samuel's thoughts raced. "We need to keep moving, but first—" He grabbed the map, spreading it across the dusty desk. "We're here," he said, pointing to their location. "Senator Kingsley's cabin is approximately 12 miles east. By road, it would be an easy drive. But cross-country, on foot, we don't have much choice," Vanessa replied, studying the map intently. "What about this?" Her finger traced a thin blue line that wound through the forest. "A stream, Beaver Creek," Samuel confirmed, "runs within a mile of this station, eventually feeds into Kingsley Lake near the senator's property. Water won't show our heat signatures," Vanessa noted, "and it might throw off tracking dogs if they bring them in." Samuel nodded appreciatively. For a laboratory scientist, Dr. Mitchell thought remarkably well on her feet. Creeks running high after the storm. Dangerous, but it might be our best option. They gathered what supplies they could carry and prepared to move out. Samuel's injured arm limited his mobility, but the first aid kit had included a sling, which helped stabilize the limb. As they worked, he found himself studying Vanessa with new eyes. Behind her, professional demeanor and theoretical knowledge, lay a core of practical determination that reminded him of the farmers he'd known all his life, people who faced natural disasters, economic hardships, and personal tragedies without surrendering. "Why risk everything?" he asked suddenly. "You could have sold this technology, lived comfortably for the rest of your life." Vanessa paused in her preparations, meeting his gaze directly. "My parents were small-scale organic farmers in California's Central Valley. They lost everything in the drought of 2014, not just crops, but generations of family history, their community, eventually their health from the stress." Her voice remained steady, but Samuel could hear the underlying emotion. "I became a scientist to solve problems like that, to help people like them, not to create weapons or make billionaires richer." Samuel nodded, understanding perfectly. Like him, she saw farming not just as a profession, but as a responsibility to the land and future generations. They came from different worlds, he with dirt under his fingernails and she with advanced degrees, but their core values aligned in ways that transcended those differences. The helicopter sounds grew louder, circling nearby. Time had run out. "Ready?" Samuel asked, shouldering their makeshift pack. Vanessa nodded, clutching her precious laptop bag. "Ready?" They slipped out the back door and into the forest once more, staying low and using the dense undergrowth for cover. The helicopter continued to orbit the ranger station, apparently not yet realizing its quarry had fled. Samuel led them on a circuitous route, deliberately avoiding easy paths that might be obvious choices for escaping fugitives. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, they reached Beaver Creek, normally a gentle forest stream, but now a churning, swollen channel after the previous night's heavy rainfall. Fallen logs and debris created small dams and whitewater sections that would make travel treacherous. "It's faster than I expected," Samuel admitted, surveying the rushing water with concern. Vanessa studied the creek thoughtfully. "We don't necessarily need to be in it the whole time, just enough to mask our trail and heat signatures." Samuel nodded in agreement. "We can follow alongside where possible, use the water when we need cover." He pointed downstream. "Creek bends east about a mile from here, then runs roughly parallel to the old logging road. Should give us a clear path toward the senator's property." They began their journey alongside the creek, occasionally wading into the cold water when helicopter sounds returned, or when the terrain forced them closer to potential search areas. The going was slow and physically demanding. Slippery rocks, fallen trees, and the constant resistance of the current when they entered the water sapped their energy quickly. Samuel kept a watchful eye on Vanessa. Despite her determination, he could see fatigue setting in. The cut on her forehead had stopped bleeding, but left a dried trail of blood down her cheek. Her clothes, inappropriate for wilderness travel to begin with, were now torn and soaked. Yet she pressed on without complaint, matching his pace despite his longer stride and lifetime of physical labor. 3 hours into their journey, they paused for a brief rest in the shelter of a large cedar. Samuel rationed out a small amount of water they'd collected in a bottle found at the ranger station. His arm throbbed persistently, and he suspected Vanessa was right. It was likely broken, rather than just badly bruised. "How much farther?" Vanessa asked, accepting the water gratefully. Samuel considered the terrain they'd covered. Another 8 or 9 miles at least. At this pace. He didn't need to finish the thought. They wouldn't reach the senators' cabin before nightfall, and traveling these woods in darkness would be nearly impossible. "We need a new plan," Vanessa acknowledged, reaching the same conclusion. Before Samuel could respond, a new sound reached them, voices distant but unmistakable. The search parties had spread out and were now combing the forest systematically. "They're between us and the cabin," Samuel whispered, straining to pinpoint the direction of the voices. Vanessa's expression hardened with resolve. "We need to change direction. Where does this creek lead if we go downstream instead?" Samuel visualized the map they'd studied. "Eventually reaches Clearwater River, then flows into Marshall Lake. There's a small town there, Riverdale, maybe 10 miles downstream. Does Senator Kingsley have a listed number, something we could call from Riverdale?" Samuel nodded slowly. "Probably. But we'd be exposed in town. They'll have people watching public places. Still better odds than trying to outrun them in the forest," Vanessa pointed out. "Especially with your injury getting worse." Samuel couldn't argue with her logic. His arm was deteriorating, and the constant physical exertion was taking its toll on both of them. In open forest, trained operators with thermal imaging and possibly tracking dogs would eventually find them. "Downstream it is," he agreed, rising stiffly to his feet. They resumed their journey, now following the creek's natural flow rather than fighting across its current. The terrain gradually changed as they descended in elevation. The forest became less dense, with occasional clearings where sunshine reached the forest floor. In these open areas, they moved quickly, aware of their vulnerability to aerial spotting. By mid-afternoon, the creek had widened considerably, its flow somewhat calmer as it spread across a broader channel. They had heard the helicopter periodically throughout the day, but the search pattern suggested their pursuers were still focused on the area around the ranger station and the eastern route toward the senator's cabin. "They haven't figured out." "We changed direction," Vanessa observed as they paused to rest again. Samuel nodded. "Won't last forever. Once they realize we're not heading east, they'll expand the search." As if to confirm his words, the distant sound of the helicopter changed. It was moving in a new pattern, widening its search area systematically. Their advantage was evaporating. "We need to move faster," Vanessa said, rising despite her obvious exhaustion. Samuel agreed, but was increasingly concerned about their physical condition. The temperature was dropping as evening approached, and their wet clothes would soon become a serious liability. Hypothermia was a real risk, especially given their depleted energy reserves. As they continued downstream, Samuel noticed Vanessa, stumbling more frequently, her movements becoming less coordinated, classic signs of hypothermia beginning to set in. He was feeling it too, a creeping lethargy that made each step require conscious effort. "We need shelter," he decided aloud, "somewhere to warm up and rest before we continue." Vanessa started to protest, but was interrupted by a violent shiver that undermined her objection. "You're right," she conceded. "But where?" Samuel scanned their surroundings with experienced eyes. The creek had carved a small ravine in this section, with rocky outcroppings on one side, Such formations often contained natural shelters, small caves or overhangs. "This way," he directed, leading them toward the rocky area. Their search was rewarded with the discovery of a modest cave, really more of a deep overhang protected by a natural stone roof. It extended perhaps 15 feet into the hillside, enough to shield them from view and the elements. Samuel immediately set about gathering dry materials for a fire, using techniques honed through decades of hunting trips. Vanessa, recognizing the importance of their task, joined in despite her exhaustion, collecting smaller twigs for kindling. "Is a fire safe?" she asked, as Samuel arranged the materials in the shelter. "They might see the smoke." "It's a calculated risk," Samuel acknowledged, "but right now, hypothermia is a more immediate threat than discovery. Besides," he gestured to the cave's configuration, "this overhang should disperse the smoke rather than letting it rise in a visible column." Using the emergency supplies from the ranger station, Samuel managed to get a small fire started. The flames were modest, but provided precious warmth. They hung their outer clothing on improvised racks to dry while huddling near the fire, wrapped in emergency blankets. As circulation returned to their extremities, the painful tingling reminded them how close they'd come to a dangerous situation. Samuel examined Vanessa's injured forehead in the firelight, gently cleaning the wound with supplies from the first aid kit. "You should get stitches for this," he noted clinically. Vanessa gave a short laugh. "Add it to the list of medical attention we both need." The shared moment of gallows humor created a small but meaningful connection between them. Two people from vastly different worlds, now united by common danger and purpose. As they warmed themselves, Samuel turned the emergency radio to the weather band, cranking the handle periodically to maintain power. The forecast called for clear skies overnight, but potential rain returning the following afternoon. Less immediate concern was the news report that followed. Local authorities continue to investigate an incident at Whispering Pines Farm, where witnesses report armed individuals were seen early this morning. Sheriff Landry has confirmed that federal agencies are involved, but declined to provide details, citing an ongoing investigation. The farm's owner, Samuel Reid, is reportedly missing, along with an unidentified woman. Samuel and Vanessa exchanged glances. The news confirmed their suspicions. Local law enforcement was aware of the situation, but the involvement of federal agencies suggested Privacore had established credible cover for their operation. "At least we know Eddie and Margaret are." "Okay," Samuel said, finding one positive aspect in the report. "They would have been mentioned if they were harmed." Vanessa nodded, guilt crossing her features. "I've brought chaos to your life, your home." Samuel waved away her apology. "You didn't bring armed men to my farm. Corruption and greed did that." He stoked the fire thoughtfully. "Besides, sometimes the right path isn't the easy one." As darkness fell, they took turns keeping watch, while the other rested. Despite their precarious situation, Samuel found his mind returning not to the danger, but to his farm. Whispering Pines wasn't just property to him, it was a legacy, a responsibility, a living entity he had nurtured for decades. Now that connection was threatened, not by natural disaster or economic hardship, but because he had chosen to help someone in need. Yet even facing that potential loss, Samuel found no regret in his decision. Throughout his life, he had witnessed The slow erosion of community bonds. Neighbors who once helped each other through crises now lived as strangers, people who averted their eyes from others' struggles to avoid involvement. He had refused to become part of that erosion. During his watch, Samuel studied Vanessa as she slept. The scientist had curled on her side near the fire, one hand still protectively touching her laptop bag even in sleep. Her face, relaxed in slumber, appeared younger, the worry lines temporarily smoothed away. He wondered what price she had already paid for her principles, friendships, career opportunities, perhaps even romantic relationships sacrificed to her work, and now her moral stand. Around midnight, a sound from outside snapped Samuel to full alertness. He doused the fire immediately, plunging the cave into darkness. Vanessa woke at the sudden movement, instantly alert despite her exhaustion. "What is it?" she whispered. Samuel held a finger to his lips, pointing toward the cave entrance. They listened intently, barely breathing. Footsteps, deliberate but cautious, approached their hiding place. A beam of light swept the area outside, briefly illuminating the entrance to their shelter. Samuel reached for the weapon he had taken from the guard, his finger finding the trigger guard. The light passed, then returned, focusing directly on the cave entrance. Whoever was out there had spotted signs of their presence. "Samuel Reid," a voice called quietly. "Dr. Mitchell? I'm Ranger Cordova with the Forest Service. If you're in there, please respond." Samuel and Vanessa exchanged suspicious glances. It could be legitimate help, or a trap to flush them out. "How do we know you're really Forest Service?" Samuel called back, keeping his position concealed within the darkness of the cave. The figure outside lowered his flashlight. "Sheriff Landry sent me to find you. Your farm manager, Eddie Thompson, told us you might have headed this way." There was a pause. "He also said to tell you that Margaret's apple pie still won the blue ribbon at last year's county fair, despite Mrs. Henderson's complaints about the judging." It was the kind of detail that wouldn't be in any official report. Something only someone who had actually spoken to Eddie would know. Samuel felt a surge of relief, but caution kept him from immediately emerging. "Are you alone?" he asked. "Yes," the ranger replied, "but I can't guarantee how long that will last. There are other search teams in the area, not Forest Service. They're claiming to be federal agents, but something doesn't add up." Samuel made a decision. "We're coming out. Don't shine that light directly at us." He helped Vanessa gather their meager supplies, including her precious laptop bag. Together, they emerged cautiously from the cave to find a middle-aged man in a Forest Service uniform waiting. His expression reflected both relief and concern. "Thank God," Ranger Cordova said quietly. "We need to move quickly. My vehicle is about a mile from here." "How did you find us?" Vanessa asked, still wary. "Sheriff Landry figured Mr. Reid would head for water to throw off pursuers. I've been checking likely shelter spots along the creek since this afternoon." He gestured to their hiding place. "This is a known spot. Local kids use it sometimes." Samuel studied the ranger, looking for any sign of deception. The man met his gaze steadily, his weathered face showing nothing but professional concern. "What's happening at my farm?" Samuel asked. "It's been cordoned off as a crime scene," Cordova explained as he led them through the forest, his flashlight beam kept low to avoid detection from a distance. Men claiming to be from Homeland Security arrived with warrants, but Sheriff Landry got suspicious when they wouldn't coordinate properly with local authorities. He called in some favors with the actual DHS and discovered no official operation was authorized. Privacor, Vanessa muttered. They have contacts who can produce convincing but fake credentials. The ranger nodded. By the time the sheriff realized something was off, you two were already gone. He's been trying to run interference, claiming jurisdiction disputes to slow down their search efforts. As they hiked through the darkness, Samuel felt a renewed surge of determination. Good people still existed, Eddie and Margaret keeping faith, Sheriff Landry questioning suspicious circumstances, this ranger risking his career to help strangers based on his own sense of right and wrong. These were the connections that mattered, the threads of community that couldn't be severed by corporate greed or technological warfare. They reached Ranger Cordova's vehicle, a standard Forest Service truck parked on a maintenance access road. The ranger helped them inside, then quickly drove away from the area, keeping his headlights off until they reached a more established road. "I've been instructed to take you to a secure location," Cordova explained. "Not the sheriff's office. They'll be watching that." "Where, then?" Samuel asked. "Samuel. Old fire watchtower on Cooper's Ridge. It's officially decommissioned, but the sheriff maintains it as an emergency backup command post. Has radio equipment, supplies, and more importantly, it's off any official maps or records from the last decade." As they drove through the night, Vanessa finally asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. "Is there any way to contact Senator Kingsley from this watchtower?" Cordova nodded. "Sheriff Landry is already working on that. He has a former deputy who now works on the senator's security detail." For the first time since their ordeal began, Samuel felt genuine hope. They weren't just running anymore. They were running toward something, toward the possibility of justice. The road grew increasingly rough as they climbed into higher elevations. Samuel's injured arm protested each jolt and bump, but the pain seemed less significant now. Physical discomfort was temporary. The consequences of surrendering to corruption would have been permanent. As they rounded a bend in the mountain road, Cordova suddenly hit the brakes. In the distance, the distinctive silhouette of a helicopter was visible against the night sky, its searchlight sweeping the forest below. "Down!" the ranger commanded, killing the engine and lights. They crouched in the darkened vehicle, watching, as the helicopter methodically searched the area to their west. It was clear their pursuers had expanded their search perimeter significantly. "They're not giving up," Vanessa observed grimly. "Neither are we," Samuel replied, his voice steady. With conviction, the helicopter eventually moved on, allowing them to continue their journey. By the time they reached the base of Cooper's Ridge, dawn was breaking, a new day bringing new possibilities and challenges. As they began the final ascent to the watchtower, Samuel found himself reflecting on the strange chain of events that had led to this moment. A simple choice to help a stranded motorist had evolved into a fight against corporate corruption and the militarization of agricultural technology. His entire life had been dedicated to nurturing growth in his crops, his community, himself. Now, that same instinct had drawn him into a larger battle for the future of farming itself. Beside him, Vanessa climbed steadily, despite her exhaustion. The laptop bag containing her revolutionary research still clutched protectively. In her determination, Samuel recognized something familiar, the same stubborn resilience he witnessed in farmers who replanted after devastating floods, who rebuilt after tornadoes, who adapted to changing markets and climates. Perhaps they weren't so different after all, the farmer and the scientist, both stewards of the Earth's potential, committed to creating something better than they had inherited. The fire watchtower stood like a sentinel above the forest canopy, its weathered structure a testament to simpler times when human eyes, not satellites, monitored the wilderness for signs of danger. As Samuel, Vanessa, and Ranger Cordova completed their arduous climb up the steep access trail, the morning sun crested the eastern mountains, bathing the tower in golden light. "It's not much," Cordova admitted as he unlocked the heavy padlock, securing the tower's base, "but it's defensible and off the grid." They climbed the narrow wooden stairs that spiraled up the tower's interior. Each step sent shooting pain through Samuel's injured arm, but he pressed on, driven by the promise of safety that awaited them above. The main observation room at the top was surprisingly well equipped for a supposedly decommissioned facility. Solar panels had been discreetly installed on the roof, providing power to a communications setup, small refrigerator, and basic lighting. A 360-degree view of the surrounding forest offered strategic advantage. They would see anyone approaching long before being discovered themselves. "Sheriff Landry maintains this place for emergency situations," Cordova explained, activating the radio equipment. "Forest fires, search and rescue operations, or situations like yours where official channels might be compromised." Samuel eased himself onto a bench, finally allowing his body to acknowledge the full extent of his exhaustion. Now that they had reached relative safety, the adrenaline that had sustained him began to ebb, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and sharper pain from his injuries. Vanessa looked equally spent, but remained standing, her attention focused on Cordova as he established radio contact with the sheriff's office. "Cooper Station active, requesting secure line to base," the ranger spoke into the microphone, using what was clearly a predetermined code. After a moment of static, a response came through. Cooper verified. "Landry here. Status? Package secured," Cordova replied. "Both elements intact but requiring medical attention." "Understood. Medical en route. Estimated arrival 90 minutes. Senator's office has been contacted through secure channel, awaiting confirmation." Vanessa's shoulders sagged with visible relief at this news. For the first time since Samuel had met her by the roadside, she gently set down her laptop bag, the physical separation a small but significant marker of increasing security. "Thank you," she said quietly to Cordova, and, by extension, to Samuel. The simple phrase carried the weight of days of fear, flight, and desperate hope. The ranger nodded acknowledgement before returning to his radio conversation, discussing logistics and security measures in the coded language of law enforcement. Samuel watched as Vanessa moved to the windows, gazing out at the vast forest that had alternately threatened and sheltered them during their escape. The morning light revealed the true extent of what they'd been through. Her clothes torn and muddied, face streaked with dirt and dried blood, eyes hollow from exhaustion, yet still burning with determination. "You never considered giving up," Samuel observed, his voice carrying a question beneath the statement. Vanessa turned from the window, meeting his gaze directly. "Neither did you." It wasn't an answer, yet somehow it was. In those 3 words lay a recognition of kindred spirits, different in background and experience, but aligned in something more fundamental than circumstance. "My father used to say that character is what you do when giving up would be easier," Samuel said, memories of his childhood rising unbidden. He lost 3 harvests in a row during the drought of 77. Bank was ready to foreclose. Everyone told him to sell what he could and walk away. But he didn't, Vanessa supplied, recognizing the shape of the story from her own family history. Samuel shook his head. Worked 18-hour days, replanted with less water-intensive crops, built irrigation systems by hand because he couldn't afford to hire it done. Nearly killed him, but he saved the farm. He looked down at his weathered hands. That's when I learned that perseverance isn't just about stubbornness. It's about believing that what you're fighting for matters enough to justify the cost. Vanessa nodded, her expression reflective. When I first discovered the security breach at my lab, my department head suggested I ignore it, said reporting it would only complicate my career path, that the technology would find its way to market eventually anyway. Her jaw tightened at the memory. He offered me a promotion, additional funding, my name on the patents, if I'd just look the other way. But that technology in the wrong hands, Samuel began, could destroy what farmers like your father fought to preserve, Vanessa finished. These nanoparticles are designed to enhance natural processes, to work with the soil's ecosystem. But with minimal modification, they could be weaponized to sterilize agricultural land for decades. Her voice took on a passionate intensity despite her exhaustion. I couldn't let my life's work become a tool for extortion or warfare, couldn't let them pervert something meant to feed people into something that could starve them. Samuel nodded, understanding completely. In her scientific sphere, Vanessa had made the same choice his father had made in the fields, to stand for what was right, regardless of personal cost. Their conversation was interrupted as Cordova concluded. His radio communication. "Good news," the ranger announced. "Sheriff Landry has made direct contact with Senator Kingsley. She's arranging secure transport to Washington and federal protection for both of you." "When?" Vanessa asked urgently. "Tomorrow morning. The senator's sending her personal security team to escort you from here to a private airfield." Cordova hesitated before adding, "There's something else you should know. Privacor has issued a press release claiming theft of proprietary technology and industrial espionage. They've named you specifically, Dr. Mitchell, and implicated Mr. Reid as an accomplice." Samuel felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. They're trying to control the narrative. "Standard tactic," Vanessa agreed grimly. "Discredit the whistleblower before they can speak." "Sheriff Landry is working to counter it," Cordova assured them. "He's given statements emphasizing the unauthorized armed presence on private property and the assault on local citizens. The state attorney general has also been briefed and is asking questions about Privacor's legal authority to conduct what amounts to a military operation on domestic soil." It was a small comfort, but Samuel recognized the strategy at work. By creating competing narratives, the sheriff was buying them time and casting doubt on Privacor's version of events. The promised medical assistance arrived 90 minutes later. A paramedic who doubled as a deputy sheriff, carrying supplies in an ordinary hiking backpack to avoid drawing attention. She efficiently assessed their conditions, confirming Samuel's arm was indeed fractured and applying a proper splint. Vanessa's head wound required several butterfly strips, but thankfully no stitches. Both received antibiotics, pain medication, and much-needed rehydration supplies. As she worked, the paramedic shared updates on the situation below. Privacor's people are still searching the forest, but they're focusing on the eastern sector near Senator Kingsley's property. Sheriffs created a perimeter of deputies, running supposed training exercises around this entire ridge. Gives us legitimate reason to turn away any unauthorized personnel. "What about my farm?" Samuel asked, the question that had been weighing on him since their flight began. The paramedic's expression softened with sympathy. "They've withdrawn from your property as of this morning." Sheriff insisted on a proper warrant, and when they couldn't produce one that stood up to scrutiny, he escorted them off the premises. She paused. Your manager and housekeeper are safe. They're staying with friends in town as a precaution." Relief washed through Samuel at this news. Margaret and Eddie were okay. His farm hadn't been seized or destroyed. Whatever came next, that foundation remained intact. After the paramedic departed, they settled into the watchful waiting that would occupy them until transport arrived. Cordova maintained regular radio contact with the sheriff's office, monitoring the movements of Privacore's search teams, which remained active but increasingly disorganized as local authorities interfered with their operations. By evening, a more substantial meal arrived via another deputy disguised as a hiker. With proper food, medicine, and relative safety, both. Samuel and Vanessa found their energy somewhat restored, though complete recovery would require more time than they currently had. As darkness fell, Cordova set up a rotation for keeping watch, insisting that both Samuel and Vanessa get proper rest while he took the first shift. Samuel's protesting body finally overruled his vigilant mind, and he fell into a deep sleep on one of the narrow cots positioned along the tower's walls. He woke to Vanessa's gentle shake several hours later, the tower illuminated only by the soft glow of monitoring equipment and moonlight filtering through the windows. "Your watch," she said softly. Samuel nodded, accepting a cup of coffee from her as he oriented himself. The tower's main room was quiet, Cordova's soft snores coming from one of the other cots. "Anything happening?" Samuel asked as he moved to the observation windows. "All quiet," Vanessa replied. "No helicopter activity for the past 3 hours. Sheriff reported Privacore's teams have pulled back to set up a base camp about 5 miles from here." Samuel scanned the darkened forest. Below, its familiar contours rendered mysterious by moonlight and shadow. This land had been part of his life since childhood, hiking its trails, fishing its streams, learning its seasons and moods. Now it had become a battleground in a conflict that stretched far beyond these woods. "May I ask you something?" Vanessa's voice broke the comfortable silence. Samuel turned from the window. "Of course. When this is over, what will you do?" There was genuine curiosity in her tone, perhaps even concern. Samuel considered the question, feeling its weight. "Go home. Rebuild whatever needs rebuilding. Plant my fields." He smiled slightly. "Pretty simple compared to your world of advanced research and global implications." Vanessa shook her head. "Not simple, essential." She joined him at the window, her reflection faint in the glass. "What you do, what all farmers do, it's the foundation everything else rests upon. My work only matters because of people like you who actually nurture things to life." The sincere respect in her voice touched something in Samuel. Throughout his career, he'd watched society increasingly dismiss farming as antiquated, even as they depended on its products. To hear this brilliant scientist acknowledge the value of his life's work felt surprisingly meaningful. "Your research," he responded, "it really could make a difference for small farmers like me." Vanessa nodded emphatically. "That's why I developed it. The nanoparticles target soil health at the microbial level, enhancing natural processes rather than replacing them with chemicals. They're programmable to adapt to specific conditions, drought, flood, pest pressure, without creating dependency or environmental damage." Passion entered her voice as she spoke about her work. A farmer using this technology could reduce water usage by 60% while increasing yield, all while improving soil health year over year. Sustainable intensification, Samuel murmured, using a term he'd read in agricultural journals. Exactly. Vanessa looked pleased at his understanding. But that's precisely why Privacor wants to control it. A technology that empowers independent farmers, threatens their business model of dependency and planned obsolescence. Samuel understood all too well. He'd watched neighboring farms go under when they couldn't afford the ever-increasing costs of proprietary seeds that couldn't be saved, chemicals that had to be purchased annually, and equipment that couldn't be repaired without manufacturer authorization. "So what happens if we succeed?" he asked. "If we reach the senator and expose Privacor's actions?" Vanessa's expression became both determined and cautious. "Best case, my research becomes open-source technology available to farmers worldwide without restrictive patents. Privacor faces federal investigation for numerous violations. The officials they corrupted are exposed." "And worst case?" She met his gaze directly. "We make it to Washington, present our evidence, and nothing changes. Privacor's influence runs deep. They could whitewash the whole incident, bury the technology, discredit us completely. Then why risk everything if success isn't guaranteed?" Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer in his heart. "Because not trying guarantees failure," Vanessa replied simply. "And some principles are worth fighting for, even when victory seems unlikely." Samuel nodded, recognizing the echo of his own philosophy in her words. Throughout his decades of farming, he'd planted countless seeds without certainty they would flourish, faced numerous storms without guarantee of survival, made difficult choices without assurance of reward. Yet the attempt itself held meaning, the commitment to right action regardless of outcome. Their conversation drifted to lighter topics as the night progressed. Farming techniques, scientific discoveries, personal histories shared in the easy camaraderie that emerges between people who have faced danger together. Samuel learned that Vanessa had abandoned a promising career at a prestigious corporate lab to focus on research that helped small-scale farmers rather than multinational conglomerates. She discovered that he had gradually converted his conventional operation to organic practices, despite significant financial risk, because he believed it was better for the land and future generations. By dawn, Samuel felt he had known Vanessa for years rather than days. Their backgrounds could hardly have been more different. She, with her advanced degrees from elite universities, he, with his practical education in the fields and barns of Whispering Pines Farm. Yet beneath those surface distinctions lay shared values that mattered far more than credentials or social circles. The promised security team arrived shortly after sunrise. 4 serious-looking individuals in unmarked vehicles who identified themselves with credentials Senator Kingsley had described to Sheriff Landry. After thorough verification, preparations began for transport to the private airfield where the senator's plane awaited. "The Privacor teams are still active," the security team leader informed them, "but they've been contained by a joint force of local deputies and state police. The FBI has also opened an investigation into potential violations of federal law regarding unauthorized paramilitary operations on domestic soil." This news validated Samuel's faith in the systems he had sometimes doubted. When good people within those systems stood firm, even powerful corporate interests could be challenged. As they prepared to depart, Ranger Cordova approached Samuel with an outstretched hand. "It's been an honor, Mr. Reid. What you did, helping Dr. Mitchell, standing up to those people, it matters." Samuel shook the ranger's hand firmly. "Just Did what needed doing. Thank you for finding us. Cordova smiled. Community takes care of its own. Safe travels. The journey from Cooper's Ridge to the airfield proceeded without incident, though tension remained high throughout the 3-hour drive. Samuel watched the familiar landscape of his home region pass by, realizing how differently he now perceived it after the events of the past days. The forests and fields he had known all his life had become both battlefield and sanctuary, revealing their secrets and challenges in new ways. At the small private airfield, a sleek jet waited on the tarmac, its engines already humming in preparation for immediate departure. As they exited their vehicles, the security team forming a protective perimeter around them, Samuel noticed a familiar silhouette standing at the base of the aircraft stairs. Sheriff Landry, a man Samuel had known since high school, waited to see them off. His weathered face showed both concern and pride as Samuel and Vanessa approached. "Thought I should see you off personally," the sheriff said, shaking Samuel's hand carefully to avoid disturbing his injured arm. "You've stirred up quite a hornet's nest." "Thank you for everything," Samuel replied sincerely. "For believing us, for protecting my farm, for standing up to Privacore." The sheriff's expression hardened slightly. "Those people crossed a line, bringing armed men onto private property in my county. That doesn't fly here, no matter how powerful they think they are." He turned to Vanessa, offering a respectful nod. "Dr. Mitchell, Senator Kingsley is expecting you. She's arranged for federal marshals to meet you when you land." "Sheriff Landry," Vanessa's voice carried deep gratitude, "your intervention likely saved both our lives. I won't forget it." A commotion at the airfield's perimeter interrupted their conversation. Vehicles approaching at high speed, the security team moving into defensive positions. "It's Privacore," one of the security members reported tersely. "Multiple vehicles, armed personnel." Samuel felt a surge of frustration. After everything they'd endured, to be intercepted now, so close to their goal. Sheriff Landry's expression remained calm as he unholstered his weapon. "Dr. Mitchell, Mr. Reid, get on that plane. We'll handle this." "They have superior numbers," Vanessa protested. "But not legal authority," the sheriff replied firmly. "Not here, not today." Samuel hesitated, reluctant to leave others to face danger he had helped create. Landry seemed to read his thoughts. "Samuel, the most important thing you can do right now is get Dr. Mitchell and her research to Washington. What happens here won't matter if you don't complete that mission." The truth of those words settled on Samuel's shoulders. This wasn't about him, or even about his farm anymore. It was about the future of agriculture itself, about whether farming would remain in the hands of those who worked the land or be controlled entirely by corporate interests, with no connection to the soil or the communities that depended on it. With a decisive nod, Samuel turned toward the plane, guiding Vanessa ahead of him. As they climbed the stairs, the sounds of confrontation grew behind them. Authoritative commands from the sheriff, angry responses from Privacore personnel. The jet's interior was luxuriously appointed, a stark contrast to the rugged conditions they'd endured over the past days. As they secured themselves in plush leather seats, the pilot's voice came through the cabin speakers. "Please prepare for immediate takeoff. We've been cleared for emergency departure." Through the window, Samuel watched as the standoff continued on the tarmac, the sheriff and his deputies forming a human barrier between the Privacore vehicles and the aircraft. It was democracy in its most elemental form, elected officials. standing firm against private power, upholding the rule of law rather than the rule of money. The jet's engines roared to full power, and they began accelerating down the runway. Samuel felt the familiar sensation of forces pressing him back into his seat as they climbed into the sky, leaving behind the forests and fields of his home. Beside him, Vanessa clutched her laptop bag with one hand and his arm with the other, her grip tightening as the ground fell away beneath them. When they reached cruising altitude, she finally released her death grip, exhaling a long breath that seemed to carry the accumulated tension of many days. "We made it," she said, wonder and disbelief mingling in her voice. "Not quite yet," Samuel cautioned, pragmatic as always. "Still have to reach Washington, convince the senator, present the evidence." Vanessa smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile he had seen from her. "True, but we've already overcome impossible odds. A storm, armed pursuers, wilderness survival, corporate mercenaries." She shook her head in amazement. "All because you chose to land your plane and help a stranded motorist." Samuel considered this, tracing the remarkable chain of events back to that seemingly simple decision. Sometimes the most important choices don't announce themselves, he reflected. They just appear as ordinary moments, asking for ordinary decency. "There was nothing ordinary about what you did," Vanessa countered. "Most people would have flown on, assuming someone else would help eventually." "Maybe," Samuel conceded, "but I've always believed we reveal who we truly are in those small decisions. The big moral questions, they're clear, dramatic. It's the everyday choices that truly form our character, one seemingly insignificant decision at a time." Vanessa nodded thoughtfully, like a farmer planting seeds, each one small, but collectively determining the entire harvest. "Exactly," Samuel agreed, pleased by her understanding. "And speaking of harvest, what do you think happens to Whispering Pines Farm after all this? Hard to imagine going back to normal." "I suspect normal might need redefining," Vanessa acknowledged. "But if Senator Kingsley is as formidable as her reputation suggests, Privacor will soon have bigger concerns than one stubborn farmer who defied them." The mention of stubbornness brought a smile to Samuel's face. "Speaking of stubborn, that technology in your bag, if we succeed in keeping it from Privacor's control, what then?" Vanessa's expression turned contemplative. "I've been thinking about that throughout this ordeal. Originally, I planned to license it through traditional academic channels, but now—" She paused, considering her words carefully. "I'm thinking of establishing an agricultural cooperative, farmers and researchers working together to implement and improve the technology without corporate gatekeeping." She glanced at Samuel, a question in her eyes. "Actually, I was hoping Whispering Pines might consider becoming a demonstration site. Your transition to organic practices gives you the perfect baseline to showcase the technology's potential." The proposal caught Samuel by surprise. "Me? There are bigger operations with more resources." "Size isn't what matters," Vanessa interrupted. "I need a farmer who understands both traditional methods and innovative approaches, someone whose values align with the technology's purpose." She smiled again. "Someone stubborn enough to stand by their principles when easier paths present themselves." As the jet crossed state lines, carrying them toward Washington and whatever awaited there, Samuel found himself considering possibilities he had never imagined when he first spotted a stranded car in a gathering storm. His simple farm might become ground zero for agricultural revolution, not through grand ambition, but through the same steady commitment to right action that had guided him all along. The flight attendant approached, offering refreshments and informing them they would land in approximately 1 hour. As she departed, Vanessa turned to Samuel with newfound determination in her expression. "Whatever happens in Washington, whether we receive justice or face further challenges, I want you to know that your actions have already changed the future." Her voice carried absolute conviction. One person standing firm in their principles can shift the entire landscape, just as a single seed can eventually transform an entire field. Samuel nodded, understanding the truth in her words. Throughout history, meaningful change had rarely come from grand gestures or powerful institutions. Rather, it grew from individual choices, from people who refused to accept corruption or injustice as inevitable, who held to their values even when doing so came at personal cost. As the plane began its descent toward Washington, Samuel gazed out at the patchwork of farms and fields visible below. From this height, individual boundaries disappeared, revealing the interconnected nature of the landscape, each farm influencing those around it, each decision about land and resources, rippling outward in ever-widening circles. His choice to land a crop duster in a storm had created similar ripples, connecting his quiet farm life to global questions about food security, corporate power, and technological ethics. Yet that momentous decision had required no grand heroism, just the simple willingness to help another human being in need. Therein lay the profound truth he had discovered through this ordeal. The most powerful force for change wasn't dramatic revolution, but consistent character, the accumulated impact of countless small choices made according to one's deepest values. As the wheels of the jet touched down on Washington soil, Samuel Reid, farmer, unlikely hero, stubborn defender of what was right, prepared to take the next step in a journey that had begun with the simplest of human instincts, seeing someone in trouble and choosing to help. The future remained uncertain, but of one thing he was sure. Whatever challenges awaited, he would face them with the same steady resolve that had guided him through storms both literal and figurative throughout his life. Sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the smallest acts of kindness. Sometimes the most profound changes start with simply doing what's right, regardless of the cost. And sometimes a farmer who stops to help a stranded traveler can change the world, one principled choice at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.